"I've never been kissed," she said, and the mountain man touched her face and said, "Trust me." It happened in a dusty frontier town, where the railroad was about to steal the only spring for miles. She was just a young orphan girl, clutching a battered map from her mother, and he was a weathered loner who swore he'd never get involved again. But that single moment in the church kitchen would bind them together against a powerful enemy. Soon, iron-booted men would ride to take the water, a sheriff would be forced to choose sides, and a long-buried truth about the spring would change everything. In the heat of the fight, she'll discover the one thing she's been searching for isn't just a home. It's someone who will stand and claim her. But can they prove the truth before the wire fence goes up forever? Or will the spring, and the life they're fighting for, be lost to the rail? Every time I see your comments, I'm reminded how stories connect us across distances, backgrounds, and hearts. If values like respect, courage, and compassion still guide you, then you're part of this story too. The freight wagon's wooden wheels clattered over the rutted main street of San Isidro, kicking up clouds of ochre dust in the late summer heat. Lena Nez Carver gripped the edges of her seat as the wagon jolted to a stop. Her traveling skirt, once a crisp blue cotton, now bore the marks of 3 days' journey across the territory. The tin strongbox pressed against her ribs like a shield. The driver clicked his tongue. "End of the line, miss." Lena climbed down carefully, one hand steadying her precious cargo. The town stretched before her in a familiar Western arrangement, mercantile with its rolled canvas awning, the Golden Spur Saloon's swinging doors, Morrison's livery stable, and the whitewashed church with its modest steeple reaching toward the cloudless sky. A crowd had gathered near the bulletin board outside the telegraph office. Their muttering carried on the hot breeze like the buzz of angry bees. Lena's heart quickened as she recognized the tall figure in the expensive black coat, Silas Voss, the railroad agent. His silver watch chain glinted as he raised his arm to nail a notice to the board. "By order of the Territorial Railroad Commission," Voss announced, his cultured voice carrying across the street, "Heaven's Spring is hereby claimed for railroad use and development." He smoothed the paper with practiced fingers. Any prior claims are hereby nullified. The townsfolk shifted uneasily. An old woman crossed herself. A rancher spat in the dust. Lena tried to edge past the crowd, keeping her head down. The scar on her cheek seemed to burn under the afternoon sun, a reminder of why she avoided gatherings like this. But a group of boys lounging against the hitching post spotted her. "Hey, look who it is, the half-breed with the ugly face," one called out. Another boy picked up a small stone. "Leave her be." The deep voice cut through the taunts like a knife through butter. Jonah Pike emerged from the alley beside the livery, leading a laden pack mule. His weathered face was calm beneath his broad-brimmed hat, but his eyes held steel. The boys scattered. Before Lena could thank him, shouts erupted from the churchyard. 2 of Voss's men were trying to wrestle the water barrel from its stand on Preacher Ruth's porch. "This here's railroad property now," one growled, straining against the barrel's weight. Jonah's boots crunched in the dirt as he crossed the street. Without a word, he positioned himself between the men and the barrel. He didn't draw the old Sharps rifle slung across his back. He didn't need to. Something in his stance made the men step back. "Reckon that barrel belongs to the church," Jonah said quietly. "And the spring that filled it belongs to all God's children." He lifted the barrel easily onto his shoulder and carried it up the porch steps. Preacher Ruth Caldwell appeared in the doorway, her iron-gray hair escaping its bun. "Much obliged, Jonah." Her rasping voice carried authority despite its softness. "Bring it right in. You too, child," she added, beckoning to Lena. "You're looking peaked from the road." Inside the church's cool darkness, Ruth settled Lena on a wooden chair while Jonah set the barrel in its corner. "Let me see that cut," the preacher woman said, tilting Lena's face toward the light streaming through the window. A flying bottle from the boys had caught her cheek, adding fresh hurt near her old scar. "It ain't nothing," Lena mumbled, but tears pricked her eyes, from pain, from shame, from the weight of memories. "I've never—" The words spilled out before she could stop them. "I've never been kissed, not proper-like, just rocks and bottles and cruel words." Ruth's hand stilled on Lena's face. Jonah turned from the water barrel, his expression softening. He crossed to where Lena sat and knelt before her chair. His calloused hand was gentle as he cupped her uninjured cheek. "Trust me," he said softly. Then he leaned forward and placed a blessing kiss on her forehead, light as a feather, reverent as a prayer. It was the way a father might bless a daughter, the way Lena's own father might have had he lived to see her grow up. Ruth worked quickly with needle and thread, her stitches neat and small. "There now," she said when she finished. "It'll heal clean." As evening settled over San Isidro, lamplight warmed the church kitchen's whitewashed walls. Ruth heated coffee on the pot-bellied stove while Jonah carved thick slices from a loaf of bread. Lena sat at the worn table, the strongbox finally set aside, and watched the domestic scene through new eyes. The kitchen smelled of coffee and bread and wood smoke. Outside, a mourning dove called softly in the gathering dusk. The tin cups clinked gently as Ruth set them out. It was a simple moment, ordinary even, but to Lena it felt like something precious and rare, like finding shelter in a storm. "Eat up now," Ruth said, passing Lena a plate. "Growing girls need their strength." Lena took a bite of bread spread thick with butter and honey. The sweet richness melted on her tongue as she studied the familiar signs of long use in the kitchen, the smooth worn spots on the table's edge, the collection of mismatched chairs, the rack of cups hung from wooden pegs. Everything spoke of welcome, of permanence, of a place where people gathered and were fed in body and spirit. Jonah sat in comfortable silence, his presence solid and reassuring. When he reached for the coffee pot, his sleeve pulled back to reveal old scars of his own, rope burns maybe, or marks from years of hard work in unforgiving country. Yet his hands were steady and sure as he poured. Through the window, Lena could see the church steeple silvered by the rising moon. The sound of horses' hooves and wagon wheels from the street grew fewer as businesses closed for the night. Even the saloon's piano fell silent. Ruth hummed as she wiped down the counter, an old hymn that Lena half remembered from childhood. The tune wrapped around her like a warm shawl, and she felt the day's tension begin to ease from her shoulders. Here in this lamplit kitchen, with the strongbox safe beside her chair and these two unlikely protectors sharing their table, Lena allowed herself to wonder if she'd found what she'd been searching for since her mother's death. Not just shelter, but sanctuary. Not just a stopping place, but a true home. The thought was too new, too fragile to speak aloud. But as she watched Jonah and Ruth move easily around each other in the familiar dance of setting things to rights for the night, she felt something long knotted in her chest begin to loosen. Whatever tomorrow might bring with Voss and his railroad men, tonight she was safe. Tonight she belonged. Ruth gathered the empty cups, their tin sides reflecting the lamplight. "Time for rest," she said. "The guest room's made up fresh, Lena. We can talk more in the morning." Lena nodded, suddenly aware of how bone-tired she was after the long journey. She touched her cheek where Jonah's blessing still seemed to linger, a memory of tenderness to counter the day's harsh moments. "Thank you," she said softly, meaning far more than just the meal in bed. Jonah met her eyes across the table. "Get some sleep, child," he said. "Dawn comes early in these parts." Morning sunlight streamed through the church kitchen windows, catching dust motes in its golden beams. Preacher Ruth set a pot of coffee to boil on the wood stove while Lena carefully placed her mother's strongbox on the worn table. The tin box had seen better days, its corners dented and its surface scratched from years of careful keeping. Lena's fingers trembled slightly as she worked the latch. Inside, wrapped in oilcloth, lay her mother's precious map of the territory. The parchment crackled as she unfolded it with reverent care. "Your mother had a gift for reading the land," Ruth said softly, setting 3 tin cups on the table. The preacher's eyes grew distant with memory. Nesba could find water where others saw only dust. Beneath the map, Lena discovered a folded paper she'd never examined closely before. The document was brittle with age, its creases worn thin from handling. As she opened it, her heart began to race. "It's an easement," she whispered, scanning the faded writing. "For heaven's spring." Ruth adjusted her spectacles and leaned closer. Her breath caught as she read the flowing script. "Thomas Carver's signature," she said. "Your father." Her finger traced the line below. "And my own mark as witness all those years ago." Jonah set down his coffee cup with deliberate care. "What exactly does it say?" "The spring is granted for communal use," Ruth read aloud. "Your father made sure it would be shared by all, townsfolk, travelers, tribal people passing through." She looked up at Lena. I remember the day they came to make it official. Your mother and father both believed water was sacred, meant for everyone's benefit. The morning light caught the silver in Ruth's hair as she sat back, lost in recollection. They were married right here in this church, you know. Such a hopeful day. Your father in his best coat, your mother wearing turquoise and silver. A shadow crossed her face. We meant to file the marriage lines at the county seat, but the pass flooded that winter. By spring, ... She trailed off, but Lena knew the rest. By spring, both her parents were gone. Then this easement, it gives me a legal claim? Lena's voice wavered between hope and uncertainty. As father's heir? It surely does, Ruth confirmed. Thomas Carver's signature carries weight, and my witness makes it binding. She glanced at Jonah. The question is whether that will be enough to stop Voss and his railroad men. Jonah's weathered face was grave. Voss won't back down easy. He's got money and influence behind him. He studied Lena with kind eyes. Are you ready for this fight, child? It won't be simple. Before Lena could answer, bootsteps sounded on the church porch. Sheriff Eli Good appeared in the doorway, his badge catching the morning light. His usually pleasant face was creased with worry. Miss Nez Carver, he said, touching the brim of his hat. Preacher, Jonah. He pulled a folded paper from his vest pocket. Just got this telegram from the territorial governor's office. They're pressing hard for that railroad spur to be completed. Ruth poured him a cup of coffee, which he accepted with a grateful nod. How bad is it, Eli? The sheriff sighed, settling into a kitchen chair. Voss plans to chain off Heaven's Spring by sunset day after tomorrow. Says he's got orders from above. He looked directly at Lena. You've got 48 hours to prove your claim in county court or that spring becomes railroad property. Lena's fingers tightened on the easement. 2 days? The paper seemed to burn in her hands, precious and terrifying all at once. The original filing should be at Fort San Miguel, Ruth said thoughtfully. Thomas would have registered a duplicate there, being military land then. Jonah pushed back his chair and stood. That's 3 days' hard ride in good weather. He looked out the window at gathering clouds. Weather's turning, though. Could slow us down. Us? Lena asked, hope rising in her chest. Can't let you make that journey alone, Jonah said simply. I know those trails better than most. Used to guide for the Army surveys through there. The kitchen grew quiet save for the pot bubbling on the stove. Outside, a jay called harshly, and somewhere in town a hammer rang against metal. Perhaps Voss's men already preparing their chains. Sheriff Good cleared his throat. I'll do what I can to slow things down here, but... He spread his hands helplessly. A lot of merchants are deep in debt to the railroad. They're scared to stand against Voss. Fear's a poor foundation for justice, Ruth said firmly. She began gathering supplies, hard bread, dried meat, coffee beans. I'll keep things steady here, mind the church records. She caught Lena's eye. Your mother would be proud of you, child, standing up for what's right. The morning wore on as they made preparations. Jonah checked his pack mules while Ruth helped Lena gather what she'd need for the journey. The preacher insisted on lending Lena a warm shawl and sturdy boots. Your mother wore these when she first came to town, Ruth said softly, holding out the boots. She left them here that last winter, meaning to collect them in spring. She squeezed Lena's hand. They should fit you now. As the sun began its westward slide, Jonah led 2 mules into the churchyard. He'd loaded them carefully, bedrolls, supplies, water skins, and the precious strongbox secured in oilcloth. Time to go, he said quietly. Lena hugged Ruth goodbye, breathing in the familiar scent of coffee and soap that clung to the preacher's shawl. Thank you, she whispered. God go with you both, Ruth replied, her voice rough with emotion. Come back safe. Sheriff Good touched his hat again. I'll do what I can here, he promised. Just hurry back with that proof. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the street as Lena and Jonah led their mules toward the eastern trail. The smell of rain rode the wind, and thunder growled in the distance. Lena looked back once to see Ruth and the sheriff standing on the church porch, their figures growing smaller with each step. Jonah's voice was gentle beside her. You ready for this? Lena touched the scar on her cheek, then squared her shoulders. The boots that had once been her mother's felt strong and sure beneath her feet. "Yes," she said. "I'm ready." They reached the edge of town just as the sun touched the horizon. Behind them, San Isidro's windows began to light up one by one against the gathering dusk. Ahead lay the wild country, 3 days of hard travel through uncertain weather to reach Fort San Miguel, and the proof they needed. Jonah adjusted his hat against the wind and gestured toward the trail. "Let's make a few miles before full dark," he said. "Storm's coming, but we might get ahead of it." Lena nodded, her mother's map and father's easement secure in the strongbox, her heart full of determination. Whatever lay ahead, she knew this was right, fighting to keep Heaven's spring flowing free for all who needed its sweet water. The thunder rolled closer as they started down the trail, 2 figures and their laden mules moving east into the deepening twilight. Behind them, the first heavy drops began to fall on San Isidro's dusty streets. The eastern sky blushed pink as Jonah checked the cinch on his mule's pack saddle. The air held the sharp bite of autumn, and frost sparkled on the church's weathered steps. He tested each rope and strap with careful fingers, knowing their journey's success might depend on these small details. "Good morning, Mr. Pike." The quiet voice made him turn. Mrs. Tabaha stood in the thin morning light, her silver hair bound neatly beneath a dark shawl. In her hands, she carried a decorated water gourd and a small leather pouch. Behind her, Atsa Yazi led his bay horse, the animal's hooves crunching softly on the frozen ground. "Ma'am," Jonah touched the brim of his hat. "Atsa. Wasn't expecting company on this ride." Atsa's usually stern face held a hint of a smile. "The spring matters to all our people. Besides, 3 sets of eyes see more than 2. The church door creaked open, and Lena stepped out wearing her mother's boots and Ruth's warm shawl. Her strongbox was tucked securely under one arm. Mrs. Tabaha moved forward to meet her. "Child," the older woman said softly, holding out the gourd. "This carried water from Heaven's spring when I blessed your mother's wedding day. Now it will help guard your journey." She pressed the leather pouch into Lena's other hand. "Healing salve for the trail." Lena's eyes glistened. "Thank you, grandmother." She used the Diné term of respect naturally, and Mrs. Tabaha's weathered face softened. "The spring has served our people since before memory," she said. "Its waters have blessed births, healed the sick, refreshed travelers." Her dark eyes grew fierce. "This railroad man, he sees only profit. He does not understand sacred things." Jonah finished securing the last pack rope and led his mule forward. "Sun's rising. We should move while the day's cool." Atsa swung smoothly into his saddle while Jonah helped Lena mount the second mule. Mrs. Tabaha touched each of their hands in blessing, murmuring words in Diné that made Atsa nod solemnly. They set out as the sun cleared the eastern hills, 3 riders heading into the vastness. The town fell away behind them, and soon they were crossing the dry wash where thin cottonwoods rattled their leaves in the morning breeze. Mesquite Flat stretched ahead, the thorny branches casting lace-like shadows on the sandy soil. "Watch how the grass bends," Jonah said as they rode. "Shows you wind direction. Important out here. Wind tells you what weather's coming." He pointed to the sky. "See those mare's tails up high? Means change is coming, maybe in a day or 2. Lena studied the wispy clouds. "Like horses' tails streaming out?" "Just so." Jonah nodded approvingly. "Your father taught me some of that, back when we served together. He had a way of reading the land." They rode in comfortable silence for a while, the mule's hooves making a steady rhythm on the hard-packed earth. Around mid-morning, Atsa drew his horse alongside Lena's mule. "The spring has many stories among our people," he said quietly. "My grandfather told of how it saved our clan during a great drought, how its waters never failed even when other sources dried up." He gestured to the harsh landscape around them. "In this country, water is life itself. That is why the elders insisted it be protected in writing, why your father understood it must be shared by all." Lena touched the water gourd at her side. "Did you know my mother well?" "Nesba was respected among our people," Atsa replied. "She understood both worlds, the old ways and the new, like you do." He studied her face. "She would be proud to see you defending the spring." The sun climbed higher, and heat began to shimmer off the rocks. They stopped briefly to water the animals at a seep Jonah knew, then pressed on through the afternoon. By late day, they reached a deep arroyo where cottonwoods grew thick along the bottom. Good place to camp, Jonah said, swinging down from his mule. Water nearby and the walls will break any wind. They made a simple camp, sharing coffee and biscuits as darkness settled over the land. Atsa took first watch while Jonah showed Lena how to hobble her mule properly. Dust to the south, Atsa reported quietly when he returned to the fire. Rider moving fast. Could be Voss's men. Jonah's face grew grim. We'll need to move quick tomorrow. That agency's our best chance at finding proof to back Lena's claim. They were on the trail again before dawn, pushing harder now. The landscape changed as they rode, red rock giving way to rolling grassland. By mid-afternoon, they caught sight of the reservation agency, a long adobe building with a whitewashed flagpole out front. Agent Phillips stood on the porch as they rode up, his face pinched with disapproval. He barely nodded to Atsa's polite greeting, focusing instead on Jonah. What brings you out this way, Pike? Need to check some treaty records, Jonah replied evenly, about Heaven's Spring. Phillips's thin lips pressed tighter. Railroad's been asking about those same records, sent a wire yesterday. We're here now, Atsa said quietly. And we have a right to see documents concerning tribal waters. The agent's face showed he wanted to argue, but after a long moment, he jerked his head toward the door. Come on then, but make it quick. Inside, the adobe was cool and dim. Phillips led them to a cluttered office where maps and documents filled several shelves. He pulled down a thick ledger and several rolled papers, spreading them on his desk. Springs marked here, he said, pointing to a survey map. Right on the edge of the old treaty line. Lena leaned forward, studying the careful notations. Her finger traced the watercourse. That means it falls under tribal water rights, doesn't it? Phillips shifted uncomfortably. Could be argued that way. Treaty language is pretty clear about water sources serving multiple communities. Atsa was already pulling paper and pencil from his saddlebag. With swift, sure strokes, he began drafting a statement about the spring's historical use and treaty status. His neat handwriting filled one page, then another. Lena, he said quietly, would you make a clean copy? Your hand is better than mine. While Lena carefully copied the statement, Jonah and Atsa gathered supporting documents that Phillips reluctantly provided. The sun was setting by the time they finished, casting long shadows through the office windows. Best bed down in the corral area, Phillips said, clearly eager to be rid of them, but you'll need to move on first thing tomorrow. They made camp near the agency corral, where other travelers sometimes stopped. The night was cold, and stars blazed overhead with fierce clarity. Lena sat wrapped in her shawl, reading over the statement by firelight. This helps our case, she said softly. But will it be enough? Atsa fed another stick to the fire. The treaty language is strong. Combined with your father's easement, it shows the spring was always meant to be shared. We've got one more day to make it count, Jonah added, checking his pocket watch. Time's running mighty short. The fire crackled, sending sparks up to join the stars. In the corral, their animals shifted and settled for the night. Somewhere in the darkness, a coyote called, its voice lonely and wild against the vastness of the land. Lena carefully stored the new documents in her strongbox, next to her father's easement and her mother's map. The papers might seem fragile things against Voss's power and money, but together they told a story of promises made and kept, of water flowing free for all who needed it. She touched the blessed gourd at her side, thinking of Mrs. Tabaha's fierce eyes and gentle hands. They took turns keeping watch through the night, knowing that somewhere behind them dust might be rising from the hooves of Voss's riders. The morning would bring another hard day of travel, another race against time to save Heaven's Spring. Dawn painted the eastern sky in bands of pink and gold as they broke camp near the agency corral. The morning air held a bite that spoke of changing seasons. Lena helped Atsa pack away the cooking gear, while Jonah checked the mule's shoes one last time. Mrs. Tabaha's fry bread, wrapped carefully in a clean cloth, made a welcome breakfast along with strips of dried jerky. They ate quickly, standing beside their mounts, knowing every minute counted now. 2 days' ride to Fort San Miguel if we push hard, Jonah said, studying the horizon. Might make it by tomorrow evening if the weather holds. They set out as the sun cleared the hills, following a well-worn trail that wound through rolling grassland. Lena's strongbox was secured behind her saddle, its contents precious as gold. The morning warmed slowly, bringing out the sharp scent of sage and juniper from the scattered brush. Around mid-morning, they heard the distinctive creak and rattle of wagon wheels ahead. Jonah raised his hand, signaling them to slow, but as they rounded a bend, they saw it was old Ben Wheeler's church supply wagon, familiar from San Isidro. "Praise be," Ben called out, reining his team to a stop. "Good to see friendly faces." He mopped his brow with a faded bandana. "You folks might want to know. Passed some of Voss's boys riding hard toward the fort yesterday. Mean-looking bunch." Jonah's weather-lined face grew serious. "How many?" "4, maybe 5. Armed proper, too." Ben shook his head. "They wasn't stopping for pleasantries." "Much obliged for the warning," Atza said quietly. He exchanged glances with Jonah, both men thinking the same thing. They needed to make better time. They parted ways with Ben, pushing their mounts a little faster now. The sun climbed high and hot, but they kept moving, stopping only briefly to water the animals at a small creek Jonah knew. By late afternoon, the trail led them into a narrow canyon where red rock walls rose steep on either side, shadows already gathered in its depths, though sunlight still painted the rim gold far above. "Good place to make camp up ahead," Jonah said as they picked their way along the canyon floor. "Know a spot where cottonwoods grow thick near a seep spring. Better than being out in the open, case those riders double back." The spot he led them to was indeed well chosen, a natural hollow where ancient cottonwoods spread their branches wide, their leaves whispering in the evening breeze. A tiny spring seeped from the rock face, providing enough water for their needs. They made camp efficiently, each knowing their tasks now. Atza tended the animals while Jonah got a small fire going. Lena gathered dry branches for fuel, the movement helping ease her saddle-stiff muscles. Later, as they sat around the fire sharing the last of Mrs. Tabaja's fry bread, Lena found herself studying the flames. The dancing light reminded her of evenings in the church kitchen with Preacher Ruth, but that already felt like a lifetime ago. "Something on your mind?" Jonah asked gently, noticing her distant expression. Lena poked at the fire with a stick, sending up a spray of sparks. "Just thinking about belonging somewhere, having people who—" She hesitated, then continued in a softer voice, "who claim you as their own." The word hung in the air between them, heavy with meaning. Jonah was quiet for a long moment, his lined face thoughtful in the firelight. "Reckon I know something about that," he said finally. "Spent many years thinking claiming was all about words, declarations, papers, promises made. But I learned different." He looked at her steadily. "True claiming shows in the walking alongside, in being there when the path gets rough." Atza nodded, adding a small branch to the fire. "Among my people, we say family is proven by actions, not words alone. By sharing the same trail, the same water, the same bread." He gestured to their small circle. "By standing together when storms come." Lena felt something warm unfold in her chest, like a flower opening to the sun. These men had chosen to ride with her, to help defend Heaven's Spring, not because of any blood tie or legal duty, but because it was right. Maybe that was its own kind of claiming. They slept in shifts that night, always keeping one person awake to watch. The canyon walls kept the worst of the wind away, and the cottonwood's leaves made soft music overhead. Dawn found them already mounted and moving, following the canyon as it wound northward. The walls gradually lowered and opened out onto a broad plain. And there, finally, they saw Fort San Miguel's adobe walls rising from the landscape ahead. The fort was smaller than Lena had imagined, more working garrison than fortress. Its sun-baked walls glowed golden in the morning light, and thin streams of cook-fire smoke rose from within. A single flag hung limp in the still air above the gate. As they approached, a guard called out from his post, "State your business." "Jonah Pike to see the quartermaster," Jonah replied, his voice carrying clearly. "About some old survey records." The guard leaned forward, peering down at them. Sudden recognition lit his face. "Pike? The scout who pulled Jenkins out of Crystal Creek during the flash flood?" "Same man," Jonah answered modestly. "Well, I'll be—" The guard disappeared from view, and moments later, the heavy gate creaked open. Come on in. Least we can do for the man who saved our best tracker. They rode into a courtyard that smelled of oiled leather, mesquite smoke, and horses. Soldiers went about their morning duties, some nodding respectfully to Atza, who was known to many there from his work as a tribal scout. The guard, who introduced himself as Corporal Davis, led them to a long adobe building set against the fort's eastern wall. Records room's in here. Quartermaster should be along shortly. Inside, the air was cooler and carried the musty smell of old paper. Shelves lined the walls, filled with ledgers, maps, and stacked documents. A scarred wooden table occupied the center of the room, its surface scattered with various papers. Lena set her strongbox down carefully, touching its worn surface for reassurance. Everything they needed to save Heaven's Spring might be here in this room, if they could find it in time. Atza moved to examine a shelf of survey maps while Jonah spoke quietly with Corporal Davis about the quartermaster's whereabouts. Lena found herself drawn to a collection of territorial documents, their edges yellow with age. Through the open door they could hear the ordinary sounds of fort life, boots on packed earth, voices calling across the parade ground, the distant ring of a blacksmith's hammer. But here in this room full of paper and ink, another kind of truth waited to be discovered. Somewhere in these records lay the proof they needed, proof that Heaven's Spring was meant to be shared, that promises made should be kept. They just had to find it before Voss's men could interfere. Lena squared her shoulders and reached for the first ledger. They had work to do. Inside the fort's records room, dust motes danced in thin shafts of morning light that streamed through the small window. The musty scent of old paper and leather bindings filled the air as Senior Clerk Thomas Madison shuffled through his ring of iron keys. Wouldn't normally allow civilians such free access, Madison said, selecting a key. But Pike here saved more than a few of our boys during that survey work. He gave Jonah a respectful nod. Man's got credit with us. The clerk's weathered hands moved deliberately as he unlocked several cabinets along the far wall. Survey records, land grants, water rights, all in here somewhere. Take what time you need, but mind everything goes back exactly where you found it. Much obliged, Jonah replied quietly. Madison paused at the door. I'll be in my office next door if you need anything. Got fresh coffee brewing, too. Once alone, they divided the tasks. Atza took the survey maps, his keen eyes scanning for familiar landmarks. Jonah worked through a stack of territorial documents, while Lena began with the water rights ledgers. The hours crept by. Sunlight shifted across the floor as morning deepened toward noon. Their only sounds were the rustle of papers, the occasional creak of floorboards, and the scratch of Lena's pencil as she made careful notes. Look at this, Atza called softly around midday, spreading a map across the central table. Here's Heaven's Spring, marked clear as day on an 1873 survey. His finger traced the familiar contours. Shows the watershed boundaries, too. Jonah leaned in, nodding. Good find. That'll help establish the spring's importance to the whole valley. They worked through lunch, accepting only coffee and hardtack from Madison. The afternoon light had begun to fade when Lena noticed something odd about one of the older ledgers. Its binding seemed unusually thick at the bottom. She ran her fingers along the warped board, feeling a slight gap. Mr. Pike, would you look at this? Jonah came over, squinting at where she pointed. He drew his small pocket knife and carefully worked the blade along the edge. There was a soft crack as the glue gave way, revealing a hidden space between the layers of the binding board. Lena's breath caught as she glimpsed something folded inside. With trembling fingers, she eased out a yellowed document. There, burned into the wood beneath it, was her father's cattle brand, TC connected by a horizontal bar. That's it, she whispered. That's Papa's mark. Her hands shook as she unfolded the paper. The words emerged crisp and clear, despite the years of hiding. Easement and water rights agreement. Below were the signatures, Thomas Carver, the county judge, and 2 witnesses. It's real, Atza said softly. The duplicate we've been searching for. Jonah squeezed Lena's shoulder gently. Your pa was clever, hiding it where lawyers wouldn't think to look. Let's get Madison in here. The clerk examined the document carefully, holding it up to the light. Papers right for the period. Signatures match our other records. He nodded slowly. This is genuine, all right? Madison's official notary seal made a satisfying thunk as he stamped his statement of authentication. The red wax gleamed as he signed and dated his certification. "There you have it," he said, carefully blotting the ink. "Legal as they come. Heaven Spring belongs to the community, just like your father intended." Lena's hands were steady now as she placed the precious document in her tin strongbox. The metal lid closed with a decisive click. "Thank you," she said to Madison, her voice thick with emotion. "For everything." The clerk waved off her thanks. "Just doing what's right. Besides," he smiled, "always good to help prove a clever man's foresight." By then the fort's evening cookfires were burning. Madison insisted they join him in the cookhouse for a proper meal before starting their journey home. The simple stew, thick with vegetables and beef, was the best thing Lena had tasted in days. The cookhouse was warm and friendly, filled with the mingled scents of food and wood smoke. For the first time since leaving San Isidro, they allowed themselves to relax. Even Atsa's usual reserve softened as he shared stories of his scouting days with some of the younger soldiers. Lena found herself smiling at Jonah's dry observations about fort life, and soon quiet laughter rippled around their corner table. The victory felt sweet, made sweeter by sharing it with these two good men who had stood beside her. They bedded down in the fort's guest quarters that night, grateful for real beds after days on the trail. Through her small window, Lena could see stars scattered across the vast desert sky. Her strongbox rested secure beside her, containing proof that would protect Heaven Spring for everyone, just as her father had wanted. Dawn came clear and cool, painting the eastern sky in bands of pink and gold. They were already mounted and ready when the fort's gates opened. Madison stood in the courtyard to see them off, passing up a packet of trail provisions. "Safe journey," he called as they rode out. "Give my regards to Sheriff Good." The morning air held that special quality found only in first light, crisp and fresh, full of possibility. Their horses' hooves kicked up small clouds of dust that glowed golden in the early sun. Even the desert itself seemed to shimmer with promise. Lena felt hope rising in her chest, solid and warm as the sun on her face. The document in her strongbox would ensure Heaven Spring remained open to all, townsfolk, travelers, and her mother's people alike. Her father's vision of sharing the life-giving water would endure. They rode steadily, the fort growing smaller behind them. The land stretched ahead, painted in shades of amber, and rose by the morning light. Atsa led them on a route that would take them home by tomorrow afternoon, in plenty of time to present their proof to Sheriff Good. "You did good," Jonah said quietly, riding beside her. "Your pa would be proud." Lena touched the strongbox secured firmly behind her saddle. "We did good," she corrected. "All of us together." Atsa nodded in agreement, and they rode on through the golden morning, their shadows stretching long across the warming earth. The victory they carried felt as real as the sun on their backs, as true as the path leading them home. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows as they approached Mrs. Tabaha's hogan. Smoke curled invitingly from the smoke hole, carrying the rich scent of mutton stew. Lena's stomach rumbled, reminding her how long they had been riding since their morning departure from Fort San Miguel. Mrs. Tabaha emerged from her dwelling, her silver hair gleaming in the fading light. She wore a dark blue skirt and a velvet blouse adorned with turquoise buttons that caught the sunlight. Her weathered face creased with pleasure at the sight of them. "Welcome, welcome," she called out in Navajo, then switched to English. "The spirits told me to expect visitors tonight." She gestured toward the corral. "There is fresh water for the horses, and the stew has been simmering since noon." They dismounted gratefully, their bodies stiff from the long day's ride. Atsa and Jonah led the horses to water while Lena followed Mrs. Tabaha inside. The hogan's interior was warm and welcoming, with woven rugs covering the packed earth floor and the savory smell of cooking filling the air. "Did you find what you sought?" Mrs. Tabaha asked, stirring the stew pot hanging over the central fire. Lena patted the strongbox she still carried. "Yes, grandmother. We found Papa's duplicate easement at the fort." The older woman nodded approvingly. Good, good, now sit, you look tired from your journey." Soon they were all settled around the fire, wooden bowls of rich mutton stew in their hands. Mrs. Tabaha had also prepared blue corn mush, its earthy sweetness complementing the savory stew. The lamplight cast dancing shadows on the Hogan's walls as they ate. "This is mighty fine cooking, Mrs. Tabaha," Jonah said, accepting a second helping. "Been a while since I tasted mutton this tender." The old woman's eyes crinkled with pleasure. Food tastes better when shared with friends who carry justice in their hearts. As they finished their meal, Lena grew quiet, her spoon pushing the last bits of mush around her bowl. The warmth and safety of the Hogan had loosened something inside her, allowing her worries to surface. "What troubles you, child?" Mrs. Tabaha asked, her dark eyes kind. Lena set down her bowl, twisting her fingers in her skirt. "I found the proof, but—" She swallowed hard. "What if the town still won't accept me? I'm not pure white like Papa, not pure Navajo like Mama. Some folks look at me like I don't belong anywhere." The lamplight flickered as silence filled the Hogan. Then Jonah cleared his throat softly. "Lena," he said, his voice gentle but firm. "You're your father's daughter, sure enough. But you're also your mother's child, and that's nothing to hide from. The easement proves your legal claim, but it's your heart that proves you're the right person to protect Heaven's Spring." Atza nodded, adding his own quiet wisdom. "Community isn't built on blood alone. It's built when people stand together, shoulder to shoulder, protecting what matters. You've shown you'll stand for both town and tribe. That's worth more than any paper." Mrs. Tabaha rose and moved to a cedar chest in the corner. She returned with a small leather pouch of corn pollen. "Bring me the easement," she instructed. Lena retrieved the document from her strongbox. The old woman held it carefully, speaking soft words in Navajo as she sprinkled a pinch of sacred corn pollen in each corner of the paper. "This blessing asks the holy people to strengthen the words written here," she explained, "to help them speak truth to all who hear them." She handed the document back to Lena. "Keep it safe, child. It carries not just your father's promise now, but our prayers as well." They bedded down for the night, Lena and Mrs. Tabaha in the Hogan, while Jonah and Atza slept in the shelter of a nearby ramada. The night was peaceful, filled with the soft sounds of crickets and the occasional cry of a distant coyote. Morning broke clear and bright, the sun painting the eastern sky in brilliant streaks of pink and gold. They had just finished a breakfast of blue corn porridge when they heard the thunder of approaching hoofbeats. A rider appeared, his horse lathered with sweat. It was young Tommy Webster from the telegraph office in San Isidro. He reined his horse to a stop, dust billowing around him. "Mr. Pike," he called out, breathing hard. "Sheriff Good sent me to find you. There's trouble about the spring." Jonah stepped forward, his face concerned. "What kind of trouble, boy?" Tommy pulled a folded paper from his vest. "Mr. Voss showed up yesterday evening with some kind of old Army survey map. Says it proves Heaven's Spring lies inside a federal improvement zone. Sheriff says you need to know before you bring Miss Lena's proof to town." Lena watched as all color drained from Jonah's weathered face. He took the paper with hands that trembled slightly, unfolding it to reveal a detailed map marked with official stamps. "Jonah," she asked, worried by his reaction. "What is it?" He stared at the map for a long moment, his jaw working. When he finally spoke, his voice was rough with emotion. "This map," he said slowly, "I helped make it. Back in '68 when I was guiding Army survey crews." He looked up at Lena, his eyes full of pain. "I knew every water source was precious out here. Should have thought harder about how the Army might use that information." Atza stepped closer, examining the map over Jonah's shoulder. "You were doing your job," he said quietly. "You couldn't have known." But Lena could see the shame weighing on Jonah's broad shoulders. The man who had stood so steady beside her these past days suddenly seemed diminished, burdened by the ghosts of his past choices. Mrs. Tabaha touched Jonah's arm gently. "The past flows like water," she said. "We cannot stop it or hold it back. But we can choose which way to channel it now." Tommy shifted nervously in his saddle. "Sheriff says to tell you Voss is gathering supporters. Says he's going to chain off the spring this afternoon if nobody can prove he's wrong about that federal zone." Jonah carefully refolded the map, his movements deliberate. "Then we'd best get moving." He looked at Lena, his eyes troubled but determined. "Your pa's easement might still hold weight, even against an Army survey. We won't know until we try." They quickly gathered their belongings and saddled their horses. Mrs. Tabaha pressed a small bundle of journey bread into Lena's hands, along with the leather pouch of blessed corn pollen. "Remember," she said softly, "you carry more than paper in that box. You carry the hopes of two peoples who share the same thirst. The morning sun was climbing higher as they mounted up. Tommy had already ridden ahead to tell the sheriff they were coming. The horses sensed their riders' urgency, prancing beneath them as they prepared to leave. Jonah sat heavily in his saddle, the weight of his past visible in the set of his shoulders, but when he turned to Lena, his eyes were clear and steady. "Whatever happens with that survey map," he said, "I aim to make things right. That's a promise." Lena nodded, understanding that some promises run deeper than words. She touched the strongbox secured behind her saddle, feeling the strength of all it represented: her father's vision, her mother's heritage, Mrs. Tabaha's blessing, and the loyalty of these two good men who rode beside her. They set out at a steady pace, leaving Mrs. Tabaha standing in her doorway, her prayers carrying after them on the morning breeze. The path to San Isidro stretched before them, and somewhere ahead lay the final test of their claim to Heaven's Spring. The afternoon sun beat down mercilessly as they approached San Isidro. Dust rose from their horses' hooves, coating their travel-worn clothes. They'd pushed hard since leaving Mrs. Tabaha's Hogan, hoping to reach town before Voss could act on his threats about the spring. Lena's mount suddenly tossed its head, ears pricking forward. Ahead, where the trail wound between two rocky outcrops, something didn't look right. Jonah raised his hand, signaling them to slow. "Riders," he said quietly, eyes narrowing. Four of them tucked behind those rocks." Atza scanned the terrain, his expression grim. "More behind us now, they've boxed us in." Before they could turn, men on horseback emerged from hiding places along the trail. Voss's hired guns, their faces hard beneath dusty hat brims. They moved with practiced efficiency, surrounding the small group. "That's far enough," called out a burly man with a scarred chin. "Hand over the strongbox, nice and easy." Lena clutched the reins tighter, her heart pounding. "This is my property. You have no right." The man cut her off with a harsh laugh. "Rights? Only right that matters out here is who's got the most guns, girl." Jonah moved his horse between Lena and the gunman. "Think careful on this," he warned. "You're crossing a line you can't step back from." Instead of answering, two riders spurred forward, making a grab for the pack mule carrying the strongbox. Atza wheeled his horse, trying to block them. In the chaos that followed, hooves kicked up clouds of dust as horses collided. Atza caught a glancing blow to the face that nearly unseated him. He stayed in the saddle, but blood trickled from his nose. Jonah fought to reach him, but another rider slammed into his horse's flank. The impact sent Jonah tumbling. He hit the ground hard, the breath knocked from his lungs. "No!" Lena screamed as one of the men yanked the strongbox free from the mule's pack. The burly leader raised his gun. "That's enough now. Anyone else wants to play hero, they'll get worse than bruises." Lena watched helplessly as the men wheeled their horses, the precious strongbox disappearing with them in a cloud of dust. Atza dismounted to help Jonah, who lay wheezing in the dirt, trying to catch his breath. "Are you hurt bad?" Lena asked, her voice shaking as she slid from her saddle. Jonah managed to sit up, though his face was pale beneath his tan. "Just knocked the wind out of me." "Atza?" The Navajo blacksmith touched his swelling nose carefully. "I'll live. But the papers." "Gone," Lena whispered, the word tasting bitter in her mouth. All their careful work, the long journey, Mrs. Tabaha's blessing, stolen in moments of violence. They limped into San Isidro as the sun was setting, a sorry sight compared to the hopeful group that had set out days before. Sheriff Good met them at the edge of town, his face troubled. Behind him stood several merchants from the town council, their expressions dark. "Jonah," the sheriff said heavily, "we need to talk." "About the ambush?" Jonah's voice was sharp. "Because those were Voss's men who—" "About keeping the peace," Good interrupted. "Mr. Voss has filed a complaint. Says you've been interfering with legitimate railroad business, stirring up trouble with the local tribes." One of the merchants stepped forward, a man named Harrison who owned the dry goods store. "We can't afford to antagonize the railroad, Jonah. They're bringing progress, jobs. The town needs that rail spur." "The town needs its water more," Jonah countered. "That spring belongs to whoever can prove legal claim," Harrison cut in. "And right now, that's looking like the railroad's improvement zone." Sheriff Good shifted uncomfortably. "I'm sorry, Jonah, but until this gets sorted out proper, I'm going to have to hold you on charges of obstruction. It's the only way to prevent more violence." You can't, Lena protested. He hasn't done anything wrong. But the sheriff was already producing his handcuffs. 2 deputies moved to flank Jonah, who stood very still, his face unreadable. It's all right, Lena, he said quietly. Sometimes a man has to bend so others don't break. He held out his wrists, letting Good secure the cuffs. Atsa stepped closer to Lena as they watched the sheriff lead Jonah away. The evening air had grown chill, or perhaps it was just the cold weight of defeat settling over them. What do we do now? Lena asked, her voice small. We keep faith, Atsa replied, though his eyes were worried. And we watch. As night fell over San Isidro, lantern light bobbed near Heaven's Spring. Voss's men worked by the yellow glow, stretching wire between newly set posts. The metallic clink of chains being secured carried clearly in the evening air. Lena stood in the church doorway watching the distant lights. Behind her, Preacher Ruth laid a hand on her shoulder. Come in, child, she said gently. You need rest. Inside, Ruth had made up a pallet in the small room off the kitchen. But even after the preacher had retired to her own quarters, Lena couldn't sleep. She lay awake, staring at the shadowed ceiling, listening to the night sounds of the town. From the saloon down the street came the murmur of voices, townsfolk gathering to whisper about the day's events. Their fear was a tangible thing, spreading like smoke through the community. Fear of losing their water rights to the railroad, fear of standing against progress, fear of choosing the wrong side. Lena's thoughts turned to Jonah alone in his cell, to Atsa, whose face would be bruised come morning, to her father's careful signature on the stolen easement, and her mother's dreams of peace between 2 peoples. She clasped her hands over her heart, forming words that were half prayer, half plea. Please, she whispered into the darkness. Show us the way forward. Show us how to make this right. Outside, a coyote called, its lonely voice echoing off the hills. In town, the saloon's piano played a halting tune, then fell silent. One by one, lanterns winked out near the spring as Voss's men finished their work. The wire fence stood complete, a dark barrier across the land. Lena rolled onto her side, pulling the quilt tighter around her shoulders. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, but for now, all she could do was try to rest. Her last thought before sleep finally claimed her was of Jonah's words at Mrs. Tabaja's Hogan. Whatever happens, I aim to make things right. She hoped with all her heart that they would find a way to keep that promise. Gray clouds pressed low against San Isidro's weathered buildings as morning crept over the town. The air hung heavy with coming rain, thick enough to taste. Preacher Ruth Caldwell walked carefully down the muddy street, balancing a steaming tin cup of coffee and a plate of biscuits. The jail's wooden steps creaked under her boots. Sheriff Good looked up from his desk as she entered. Dark circles under his eyes suggested a sleepless night. Morning, Preacher, he said quietly. He's awake. Ruth nodded, moving past to where Jonah Pike sat in the cell, his broad shoulders slumped. The bars cast thin shadows across his face in the dim light. Brought you something hot, she said, passing the coffee and plate through the feeding slot. Thought you might need it this morning. Jonah's weathered hands wrapped around the warm tin cup. Much obliged. His voice was rough with fatigue. He took a slow sip, then set the cup aside, something clearly weighing on his mind. There's something I need to tell you, Preacher, he said finally. About that army survey Voss is using against us. Ruth settled onto the wooden stool outside his cell, smoothing her skirts. I'm listening. I was young then, Jonah began, his eyes distant, working as a guide for the Army engineers. They were mapping water sources, planning for future settlements. He paused, taking another sip of coffee. I knew the territory better than most. Led them right to Heaven's Spring. Thunder rumbled outside, soft and low. Ruth waited patiently as Jonah gathered his thoughts. What I didn't know then was how they'd use those maps, how they'd twist the meaning of improvement zone to take what wasn't theirs to take. His voice grew heavy with regret. I helped them mark boundaries that would later hurt good people, both townfolk and Dene. The past has weight, Ruth said gently, but it's what we do now that matters most. Jonah nodded slowly. That's why I built something back then, something that might help us now. He leaned forward, his voice dropping lower. A diversion box and flow gauge, Up where the spring first surfaces. Built them proper with Army engineering plans. They're still there on public land, proof that the water's been managed for everyone's use all these years. Ruth's eyes widened slightly. How long ago? 15 years at least, all documented in the Army Corps' records. Jonah's expression grew intent. That box and gauge show the spring's been treated as communal property since before the railroad ever laid a mile of track. Outside the jail, wagon wheels creaked through the mud as the town began stirring to life. Ruth considered Jonah's words carefully. Legal precedent, she said thoughtfully. If we can prove it. I can lead someone right to them, Jonah replied. They're set in stone and concrete, with Army Corps markings clear as day. Meanwhile, across town, Lena and Atza had been busy. Word had spread quietly among the women of San Isidro, passed over back fences and through kitchen doors. As the morning wore on, they began to gather, wives, mothers, sisters, each carrying buckets and water jugs. Mrs. Harrison, the merchant's wife, was there despite her husband's railroad ties. Sofia Garcia from the cantina brought her 3 daughters. Even old Mrs. Whitaker hobbled out with her copper kettle. Lena felt her heart swell at the sight of them all standing together in the drizzling rain. Atza nodded approvingly. They understand what's at stake, he said quietly. Water is life itself out here. The women moved as one toward Heaven's Spring, their buckets swaying. But before they could reach the new fence, armed guards stepped out from behind the rocks. The metallic click of rifle hammers being drawn back cut through the pattering rain. That's far enough, one guard called out, his voice hard. This is railroad property now. Mrs. Harrison stepped forward, chin raised. We've been drawing water here for years. Our families depend on it. Don't matter none now, another guard said, lifting his rifle. Clear out, all of you. Lena's hands tightened on her bucket handles as she watched the women slowly retreat. Their faces were a mixture of fear and fury. This wasn't just about water rights anymore. It was about their very way of life. Back in town, the women gathered in Ruth's church kitchen, their wet skirts dripping on the wooden floor. The air was thick with frustration and worry. What'll we do? Sofia Garcia asked, wringing her hands. My girls can't haul water all the way to the creek crossing. It's too far. And my garden will die without the spring, Mrs. Whitaker added, her voice quavering. Been tending those plants 30 years. Lena looked at their concerned faces, feeling the weight of their trust. We're not giving up, she said firmly. Jonah and Atza and Preacher Ruth, they're still fighting for us. We just need to stay strong. As evening approached, the rain fell harder, drumming on tin roofs and turning the streets to mud. Sheriff Good stood in his office, staring out at the glistening street. The weight of his badge felt especially heavy today. He turned back to his desk, picking up the telegram he'd received that afternoon. The territorial governor was pressing for a quick resolution. The railroad's lawyers were circling. And yet, Good pulled on his oilskin coat and headed for the cells. Jonah looked up as he approached, reading something in the sheriff's expression. About that diversion box, Good said slowly. How sure are you it's still there? Sure as sunrise, Jonah replied. Built it to last with Army Corps specifications. Carved the date right into the concrete. Good's fingers drummed against his gun belt. And you'd stake your word on it being proof of communal use? I'd stake my life on it. Jonah stood, moving closer to the bars. Let me show you, Eli. Let me make this right. The sheriff was quiet for a long moment, listening to the rain. Finally, he pulled out his keyring. If I let you out, you give me your word. No running, no fighting. Just show me these structures and then come straight back here. You have my word, Jonah said solemnly. The cell door creaked open. Good stepped back, his hand still near his pistol. First light tomorrow, he said. We'll ride out and see this proof of yours. But any trouble? He left the threat unspoken. Jonah nodded, understanding the trust being placed in him. Thank you, Eli. Through the jail's window, they could see the rain-slick street outside, puddles reflecting the lamplight like scattered coins. Tomorrow would bring either redemption or ruin. For now, the rain continued to fall, washing the dust from the air and giving life to the thirsty land, just as Heaven's Spring had done for generations. The next dawn waited just hours away, carrying the weight of all their hopes with it. In her bed at the church, Lena slept fitfully. In his forge, Atza worked late into the night, the ring of his hammer a counterpoint to the falling rain. And in his cell, Jonah sat awake watching water trickle down the window pane, knowing that come morning, he would have one chance to make things right. The pre-dawn air hung heavy with dampness as Sheriff Good's boots echoed down the jail corridor. His keyring jangled softly as he approached Jonah's cell. Through the barred window, the sky was just beginning to lighten, turning from black to deep purple. "Time to make good on your word," Good said quietly, sliding the key into the lock. The cell door creaked open. Jonah stood, stretching his stiff muscles after the long night. He'd barely slept, his mind occupied with what lay ahead. "Much obliged, Sheriff." Atza was waiting outside with their horses, leading Jonah's familiar mount. Steam rose from the animal's nostrils in the cool morning air. No one else stirred in the sleeping town as the three men swung into their saddles. They rode in silence, hooves squelching in the mud from yesterday's rain. The storm had cleared overnight, leaving behind a freshly washed world. Water droplets sparkled on every leaf and blade of grass. Jonah led them along a winding path that branched away from the main spring channel. Willows grew thick here, their branches sweeping low over the trickling water. After 20 minutes of careful riding, he reined his horse to a stop. "There," he said, pointing through the trees. "Just past those rocks." They dismounted, leading their horses through the dense willows. The diversion box came into view, a sturdy wooden structure reinforced with stone, its weathered boards still holding strong against time and elements. Water flowed through it steadily, channeled toward the town's troughs and cisterns. Good knelt beside it, running his hand over the old wood. "Well built," he commented. "Army Corps work, sure enough." "The gauge is on the other side," Jonah said, moving around the structure, carved right into the stone. They followed him. There, set into a flat rock face, was a simple but precise water gauge. Below it, etched numbers marked the years. Good leaned in close, wiping away some moss to read the earliest date. 1873, he read aloud. "That's 5 years before the railroad even surveyed this territory," Jonah finished. "We built it to help the town manage water flow during dry spells. Everything was documented in the Army Corps records." Atza nodded slowly. "The people have relied on this water for generations. This proves it was never abandoned or unclaimed." Good stood, brushing dirt from his knees. His expression was thoughtful as he studied the diversion system. Water burbled through it steadily, the sound peaceful in the early morning quiet. "This changes things," he said finally. "Prior beneficial use, properly documented, that carries weight in territorial law." The sun was starting to break through the clouds as they mounted up again. Golden light spilled across the landscape, making the wet leaves glitter. They rode faster on the return journey, hope spurring them on. As they approached town, Atza pulled his horse alongside Good's. "With your permission, Sheriff, I'll ride ahead to the telegraph office. The fort captain's affidavit about the duplicate easement could strengthen our case further." Good nodded. "Go ahead. We'll need every piece of evidence we can get." Atza spurred his horse forward, soon disappearing around a bend in the road. Jonah and Good continued at a steady pace, the town's buildings coming into view ahead of them. "I've got to ask," Good said after a while. "Why didn't you mention this diversion box sooner?" Jonah was quiet for a moment, considering. "Shame, I reckon. That survey work I did, it helped the railroad claim land that wasn't theirs to take. Didn't feel right using anything connected to those days." He adjusted his reins. "But sometimes making things right means facing up to the past." They rode the rest of the way in companionable silence. The town was awakening as they arrived, smoke rising from chimneys, shopkeepers opening their doors. Several people paused to watch as the sheriff led Jonah back to the jail. Inside, Good didn't lock the cell door. Instead, he poured 2 cups of coffee and settled behind his desk. "We'll need to document everything we saw out there. Write it all down proper like for the court." Jonah accepted the coffee gratefully. "I can draw up the specifications too, show exactly how the diversion system works, might help explain its importance." They spent the morning working on statements and drawings. Through the window, they could hear the usual sounds of town life: wagon wheels, children's voices, the blacksmith's hammer. But there was an undercurrent of tension, everyone knowing what hung in the balance. At the telegraph office, Atza carefully composed his message to the fort captain. He explained about the duplicate easement, requesting formal confirmation of its authenticity. The telegraph key clicked steadily as the operator sent the words racing along the wire. Throughout the day, word spread through San Isidro. People gathered in small groups talking in low voices about the diversion box and what it might mean for their cause. Hope began to stir again, cautiously at first, then growing stronger. By late afternoon, Atza returned with good news. The fort captain had responded quickly, promising to send a sworn affidavit by special courier. The document would confirm both the existence and legitimacy of the duplicate easement that had been seized. As evening approached, people began making their way to the church. They came in ones and twos at first, then in larger groups. Merchants and ranchers, farmers and craftsmen, the whole town seeming to flow together like tributaries joining a river. Inside the church, Preacher Ruth welcomed them, her calm presence helping to settle nerves. Lena sat near the front, the blessed gourd Mrs. Tabaha had given her held carefully in her lap. Her fingers traced its smooth surface, drawing strength from it. The wooden pews filled steadily. Mrs. Harrison sat with Sophia Garcia, their previous social divisions forgotten in common cause. Old Mrs. Whitaker found a place near the front, her walking stick tapping softly on the floorboards. Even some of the merchants who had initially sided with Voss were present, their expressions thoughtful. Jonah and Good arrived together, having finished their documentation. They found seats near Atza, who was explaining the expected affidavit to several interested townspeople. The air hummed with quiet conversation and cautious optimism. Lena watched them all, these people who had become her community. The blessed gourd felt warm in her hands, almost alive with possibility. Her earlier fear had transformed into something stronger: determination. Whatever happened in court tomorrow, they would face it together. Through the church's windows, the evening sun painted everything in soft gold. Outside, Heaven's Spring continued its eternal flow, sustaining life as it had for generations. Inside, a community gathered its strength, ready to defend what was right. Dawn painted the eastern sky in delicate shades of pink and gold as people gathered in front of the church. The morning air was crisp, carrying the scent of damp earth from yesterday's rain. Preacher Ruth stood on the steps, her worn Bible tucked under one arm, watching as both townsfolk and Diné families arrived in small groups. The muddy street glistened in the early light. Men and women carried wooden buckets, poles, and other items that showed their daily reliance on Heaven's Spring. Their boots and moccasins left clear impressions in the soft ground as they assembled, forming a determined crowd. Lena adjusted her shawl against the morning chill, the blessed gourd secure in her satchel. Mrs. Tabaha stood beside her, straight-backed and dignified in her traditional dress. The elder woman's presence helped steady Lena's nerves as they prepared for the 6-mile walk to the courthouse. "Remember," Mrs. Tabaha said softly in Navajo, "the spring has sustained our people since before any papers were written. Its truth flows deeper than ink." Jonah checked his pocket watch, then moved through the crowd speaking quiet words of encouragement. His familiar presence helped calm those who seemed anxious about the journey ahead. Behind him, Sheriff Good sat his horse ready to escort the procession. As the sun cleared the horizon, Preacher Ruth raised her hand for attention. The murmur of conversation faded as she spoke. "Friends and neighbors, we walk today not just for ourselves, but for those who will come after us. Let's move forward with dignity and purpose." The procession formed naturally, with Ruth taking the lead. Lena fell into step beside Mrs. Tabaha, their skirts brushing the damp ground. Jonah walked close behind them, his steady footfalls a reassuring rhythm. The rest of the crowd followed, carrying their buckets and tools like badges of honor. They passed the mercantile, where Mr. Chen stood in his doorway. After a moment's hesitation, he grabbed his own bucket and joined the line. More townspeople emerged from their homes and businesses, swelling their numbers. Even old Mrs. Whitaker insisted on walking, leaning on her son's arm. The morning sun climbed higher as they left San Isidro behind. Their path took them past Heaven's Spring, where Voss's men lounged near their newly strung fence. The guards straightened as the procession approached, hands drifting toward their weapons. But no one in the crowd showed fear. Lena's chin lifted as they passed. She could feel the guards' sullen stares, but the weight of the community around her made her strong. Mrs. Tabaha hummed softly, a traditional song about water blessing the land. The guards watched in silence as the long line of people moved past. Their expressions shifted from scorn to uncertainty as they witnessed the size and dignity of the gathering. One young guard even removed his hat, perhaps reminded of his own family's reliance on common water rights. The road stretched ahead, winding through scrubland dotted with juniper and piñón. Though the morning was cool, the walk was not easy. Older folks and children set a slower pace, but no one complained. They shared water and encouraging words, helping each other along. Near a bend in the road, they passed the Martinez family's sheep camp. The herders quickly rounded up their flock to let the procession through. Seeing their neighbors walking with such purpose, they too joined in, their sheep bells adding a musical counterpoint to the sound of footsteps. The sun stood high when they finally caught sight of the courthouse settlement. The two-story brick building rose above the other structures, its windows gleaming. People paused to straighten clothes and dust off boots, wanting to present a respectable appearance. Sheriff Good rode ahead to announce their arrival. The courthouse steps were already crowded with curious onlookers drawn by news of the water rights dispute. Among them stood Silas Voss, his tailored suit marking him apart from the local folk. His confident smile faltered slightly as he watched the size of the approaching crowd. Preacher Ruth led them up the courthouse steps, her back straight despite the long walk. Inside, the main courtroom was large but still struggled to contain everyone who pressed in. The wooden benches filled quickly. Those who couldn't find seats stood along the walls, their buckets and poles visible testimony to their stake in the case. Judge Harland, a lean man with steel-gray hair, surveyed the crowd from his raised desk. His eyebrows rose slightly at the number of people, both Anglo and Diné, who filled his courtroom. He adjusted his spectacles and lifted his gavel. "This court will come to order," he announced, his voice carrying to the back of the room. "We are here to hear arguments regarding water rights to what is commonly known as Heaven Spring. Mr. Voss, representing the railroad's interests, you may begin." Voss rose smoothly, adjusting his vest. "Your Honor, this is a simple matter of progress and proper development. The railroad's survey maps clearly show—" The courtroom doors burst open. Atsayazi hurried in, his normally neat appearance somewhat disheveled from hard riding. In his hand, he clutched an official-looking document bearing the fort's seal. "Your Honor," he called, striding forward, "I have here a sworn affidavit from the fort captain confirming the existence and legitimacy of the duplicate easement that was temporarily misplaced." A murmur ran through the crowd. Judge Harland held out his hand for the document, reading it carefully while Voss shifted impatiently. The room grew quiet enough to hear the clock ticking on the wall. "This appears to be in order," the judge said finally. "Mr. Voss, would you care to address the matter of the seized documents?" Voss's polished manner cracked slightly. "Your Honor, any such papers were likely collected as part of a routine review of—" "If I may, Your Honor," Sheriff Good interrupted, standing, "I have here documented evidence of the spring's long-standing public use, including Army Corps records of a diversion system built in 1873. The judge accepted these additional papers, adding them to the growing stack of evidence. His expression remained neutral, but his eyes were sharp as he reviewed each document. Lena sat between Mrs. Tabaha and Jonah, her heart pounding. The blessed gourd rested in her lap, cool and smooth against her palms. Around her, the community that had walked 6 miles together waited in tense silence. The morning light streamed through the high windows, dust motes dancing in the golden beams. Outside, the sound of horses and wagons drifted in, life continuing its normal rhythm while inside. The future of Heaven Spring hung in the balance. Judge Harland cleared his throat, drawing all eyes back to him. The worn wood of the witness stand creaked as he shifted in his seat, preparing to hear testimony that would determine not just water rights, but the very fabric of the community gathered before him. Judge Harland adjusted his spectacles and motioned to Voss's lawyer. "Counselor, present your evidence." Marcus Wheeler, the railroad's attorney, stepped forward with practiced confidence. His polished boots clicked against the wooden floor as he approached the bench, carrying a leather document case. The room fell silent as he withdrew a large, carefully preserved map. "Your Honor, this official United States Army survey conducted in 1872 clearly shows Heaven Spring lies within the Federal Improvement Zone." Wheeler spread the map across the judge's desk with a flourish. "As such, the railroad's claim through proper channels takes precedence over any local arrangements." Voss smiled thinly from his seat, shooting a dismissive glance at Lena and the assembled townspeople. The map's yellowed paper crackled as Judge Harland leaned forward to examine it, his finger tracing the carefully drawn boundaries and notations. The survey appears genuine, the judge acknowledged, looking up. Miss Nez Carver, do you wish to present contrary evidence? Lena's heart hammered against her ribs as she rose. The floor seemed to sway beneath her feet, but Mrs. Tabaha's gentle touch on her arm steadied her. She walked forward, clutching her own evidence close. Yes, Your Honor. Her voice came out clearer than she expected. She laid out 3 photographs of the diversion box, their edges slightly curved from being carried. These show the water management system built by my father, Thomas Carver, in 1873. It's been maintaining the spring's flow for the town ever since. The judge picked up the photographs, studying them in the morning light that streamed through the high windows. Lena continued, drawing out a worn leather notebook. Here are the gauge records, Your Honor, showing regular measurements and maintenance dating back nearly 20 years. She opened it carefully to show the neat columns of numbers and dates. Sheriff Good can confirm these are in my father's hand. The sheriff stood. I can indeed, Your Honor. I've known Thomas Carver's writing since he first came to these parts. Wheeler scoffed. A few amateur photographs and unauthorized modifications hardly override federal authority. If I may, Your Honor, Preacher Ruth interrupted, rising from her seat. Her voice carried the same quiet authority she used in Sunday sermons. She approached the bench carrying a thick leather-bound volume and several papers. I have here the church records, including Thomas Carver's marriage to Nesba Begay, Lena's mother, performed in my church in 1876. The judge accepted the documents, reading carefully. The marriage lines appear to be in order, though I note they weren't filed with the county. That winter saw the worst flooding in 20 years, Your Honor, Ruth explained. The pass to the county seat was blocked for months, but I also have the baptismal record for Lena, signed by both parents, and witnessed by 3 deacons still living. Outside the courthouse windows, the murmur of prayers could be heard from the townsfolk gathered in the shade of the old cottonwoods. Inside, the air grew thick with tension, as Judge Harland examined each document in turn. Voss leaned forward to whisper something to Wheeler, who nodded and stood again. Your Honor, while these personal papers may be touching, they don't supersede the railroad's legal claim to develop vital infrastructure. I'm not finished, Ruth said firmly. She produced the fort captain's affidavit. This sworn statement confirms the existence and validity of the original easement, which granted Heaven's Spring for communal use. The easement predates both the Army survey and the railroad's claim. The judge read the affidavit slowly, his expression thoughtful. The clock on the wall ticked loudly in the silence. Lena felt Jonah's steady presence behind her, giving her strength. Voss's confident smirk began to fade as the judge laid down the last document and removed his spectacles. Judge Harland surveyed the crowded courtroom, taking in the mix of faces, Anglo and Diné, merchants and ranchers all waiting on his words. The law exists to serve justice, not merely progress, he began. This court finds the railroad's claim to Heaven's Spring is void on multiple grounds. First, the evidence clearly shows established beneficial use predating the federal survey. Second, the original easement, though currently missing, is confirmed by multiple credible witnesses, including a sworn statement from a United States Army officer. A ripple of relief moved through the crowd. Mrs. Tabaha clasped her hands together, her eyes bright. Voss's face darkened as the judge continued. Furthermore, this court recognizes Miss Lena Nez Carver as the lawful heir of Thomas Carver, with all rights and responsibilities thereto. The judge's stern expression softened slightly as he looked at Lena. Your father's careful records and foresight in building the diversion system speak well of his character. Lena felt tears prick at her eyes. Jonah's hand found her shoulder, squeezing gently. However, the judge raised his voice slightly. Given the spring's vital importance to this community, I am ordering it be held in trust. He paused, ensuring he had everyone's attention. The church deacons and Diné elders will jointly oversee its management, with Sheriff Good appointed as steward to ensure fair access for all. Murmurs of approval filled the room. Mrs. Tabaha nodded in satisfaction, while Preacher Ruth smiled. Even Mr. Chen, standing near the back, looked relieved. Sheriff, the judge continued, you'll file quarterly reports on the spring's maintenance and use. And Mr. Voss, he fixed the railroad agent with a stern look, you'll ensure those survey markers are removed by sundown tomorrow. Voss stood abruptly, his chair scraping against the floor. Your Honor, the railroad will appeal. You're welcome to try. Judge Harlan said dryly. But I suggest you first explain to your superiors why you attempted to seize legally documented private property without proper compensation. He picked up his gavel. This court's ruling is final, dismissed. The sharp crack of the gavel echoed through the room. For a moment, no one moved. Then a wave of joy swept through the crowd. Mrs. Tabaha wrapped Lena in a tight embrace, whispering a blessing in Navajo. Jonah's weathered face broke into a rare, full smile. Preacher Ruth gathered the documents carefully, her hands trembling slightly with relief. Sheriff Good was already making notes about the spring's maintenance, his face showing quiet satisfaction. Through the courthouse windows, they could hear cheers from the people waiting outside. The news spread quickly through the crowd. Heaven's Spring would remain open to all, protected by law and community alike. Voss and Wheeler gathered their papers with sharp, angry movements, but few paid them any attention. The railroad agent's defeat seemed small compared to the victory of people working together. Lena stood in the middle of it all, feeling the weight of the past few days lift from her shoulders. She reached into her satchel and touched the blessed gourd Mrs. Tabaha had given her. Its smooth surface reminded her of all that had brought them to this moment. Not just legal papers and photographs, but the bonds between neighbors who chose to stand together. The morning light streamed through the high windows, catching the dust motes that danced in the air. Outside, the sounds of celebration grew as more people heard the news. Inside, Lena found herself surrounded by those who had walked beside her, fought beside her, prayed beside her. In their faces, she saw something she'd been seeking since her parents' death. The look of family, of belonging, of being truly claimed. The courthouse doors creaked open, spilling sunlight onto the weathered wooden steps. As Lena stepped out into the morning air, her heart skipped a beat. Along the street, Voss's hired guns stood in a loose line, their hands hovering near their rifle holsters. The victory in the courtroom suddenly felt fragile as glass. Sheriff Good tensed beside her, his own hand straying toward his gun belt. The townsfolk who'd been celebrating moments before drew back, pressing against the courthouse walls. Only the quiet whisper of wind through the cottonwoods broke the silence. Jonah Pike moved forward with the same steady calm he showed when approaching a spooked horse. His empty hands hung loose at his sides, clearly visible. Atsa Yazi fell into step beside him, matching his measured pace. Together they made their way down the courthouse steps, their boots striking the wooden planks with soft thuds. Lena held her breath. The morning sun caught the metal of gun barrels and belt buckles, making them gleam. A horse stamped nervously in the dusty street. Someone's child whimpered, quickly hushed. Jonah stopped a few paces from the hired men, close enough to see their faces clearly. His voice carried across the tense space, gentle but firm. A man can win and still be wrong. The words hung in the air. One of the younger guns shifted his weight, uncertainty crossing his face. Walk away, Jonah continued, meeting each man's eyes in turn. The lines around his eyes deepened with understanding. There's been enough fighting over water in these parts. Atsa stood silent beside him, his presence a reminder of other battles, other choices. The morning light caught the silver in his hair, the quiet dignity in his bearing. Seconds stretched like hours. Lena's fingers found the blessed gourd in her satchel, clutching it tight. Preacher Ruth's whispered prayer was barely audible behind her. Then, like ice breaking in spring, the tension cracked. The first gunman lowered his rifle, then another. Soon weapons were being returned to saddle scabbards. Relief rippled through the crowd as horses were mounted, reins gathered. Only Silas Voss remained rigid with fury. His face had gone red beneath his fine hat, and his knuckles were white on his saddle horn. He fixed Lena with a glare that made her step back involuntarily, but Jonah moved to stand between them. It's done, Jonah said quietly. The spring belongs to all of us now, legal and proper. Voss's horse danced beneath him, picking up its rider's agitation. For a moment, it seemed he might say something more, but the sight of his men already turning their horses around seemed to deflate him. With a sharp jerk of his reins, he spurred his mount forward, kicking up dust as he galloped out of town. His hired guns followed, their departure marked by the thunder of hoofbeats fading into distance. The air itself seemed to grow lighter. People began moving again, releasing held breaths, stepping away from walls. Mrs. Tabaha hurried forward from where she'd been standing with the other Diné women, her arms opening wide to embrace Lena. You see? she said softly in Navajo, holding Lena close. The spring knows its true family. Her familiar scent of sage and wool wrapped around Lena like a blanket, and for a moment she felt her mother's absence keenly, even as she found comfort in Mrs. Tabaha's arms. Preacher Ruth moved through the crowd, touching shoulders, offering quiet words of thanks. When she reached Lena and Mrs. Tabaha, there were tears shining in her eyes, but her smile was bright as sunshine on water. The Lord works in mysterious ways, she said, her voice rough with emotion. Sometimes through court papers, and sometimes through brave hearts. She reached out to squeeze Lena's hand, including Mrs. Tabaha in her warm look. Sheriff Good approached Jonah, shaking his head with admiration. That could have gone another way entirely. Could have, Jonah agreed, but it didn't need to. He glanced at Atsa, who nodded in silent understanding. Throughout the morning, people began drifting back toward town, their wagons and horses raising dust clouds that glowed golden in the strengthening light. The Chinese laundryman, Mr. Chen, stopped to bow slightly to Lena as he passed. Mrs. Martinez from the mercantile pressed a small package of candy into her hands with a whispered, "Gracias, niña." By afternoon, San Isidro had settled into a quiet but joyful mood. Women gathered on porches to share news and coffee. Men stood in small groups discussing plans for maintaining the spring's diversion system. Children played in the street without fear of strange riders. As evening approached, lanterns began appearing along Main Street, their warm glow pushing back the gathering dusk. Outside the church, Preacher Ruth directed the setting up of tables for a modest celebration. The smell of fresh bread and stewing meat drifted from several kitchens. Lena sat on the church steps watching the lanterns being lit one by one. Their light reminded her of the stories her mother used to tell about stars being hung in the sky. Jonah settled beside her, his familiar presence comforting. "You did good today," he said simply. "Your pa would be proud." "We all did good," Lena replied, thinking of everyone who had stood together. Mrs. Tabaha with her blessings, Atsa with his quiet strength, Preacher Ruth with her careful records, and Jonah himself, facing down guns with nothing but truth in his hands. Mrs. Tabaha appeared with bowls of mutton stew, the steam rising fragrant in the cooling air. Other women followed, carrying dishes to the tables, tortillas, beans, roasted corn, and pies. The church bell rang softly, calling people to gather. As darkness settled fully over San Isidro, the lantern-lit street hummed with quiet conversation and occasional laughter. Children darted between the pools of light, playing tag. At one table, Atsa spoke with Sheriff Good about plans for checking the spring's flow gauge. At another, Preacher Ruth shared coffee with Mrs. Martinez and Mr. Chen, their differences forgotten in the warmth of community. The night air carried the scent of sage from the hills and wood smoke from cooking fires. A few stars peeked through gathering clouds, promising rain. Tomorrow would bring new challenges, maintaining the spring, organizing its shared use, healing old wounds between neighbors. But tonight, under the gentle glow of lanterns, San Isidro celebrated not just the saving of Heaven Spring, but the discovery that justice could be won without violence, that community could be stronger than greed. Lena looked around at the faces lit by lantern light, faces that no longer turned away from her scarred cheek, faces that now smiled in welcome rather than suspicion. She had found more than legal victory in the courthouse today. She had found her place, her people, her home. The lanterns continued to glow along Main Street, their light a quiet affirmation of all that had been won and saved. The night settled over San Isidro like a soft blanket, wrapping the town in peace, well-earned and long-awaited. Morning dawned clear and bright over San Isidro, the air still fresh from yesterday's tension breaking like a summer storm. Dew sparkled on the church steps where a small group gathered in the early light. The wooden boards, worn smooth by years of faithful feet, felt solid beneath Lena's shoes as she stood between Jonah and Mrs. Tabaha. Preacher Ruth held a crisp sheet of paper in her weathered hands, her voice carrying clearly in the morning stillness. "This petition for guardianship," she began, the familiar rasp in her voice softened by emotion, "states that Jonah Pike wishes to assume legal responsibility for Lena Nescarver until she reaches the age of 21. Lena's heart quickened. She glanced up at Jonah, who stood straight and tall beside her, his eyes fixed on Preacher Ruth. The morning sun caught the silver in his beard and the careful way he'd combed his usually unruly hair. As her guardian, Ruth continued, he commits to providing for her education, welfare, and moral instruction, to protect her interests in all legal matters, and to guide her with the same care and devotion as a natural father. Mrs. Tabaha nodded approvingly, her silver hair gleaming in its traditional bun. She wore her finest wool dress and turquoise jewelry, treating the occasion with the ceremony it deserved. Beside her, Atza stood in a clean work shirt, his blacksmith's hands folded respectfully before him. Sheriff Good shifted his weight on the steps, his badge catching the morning light. He'd brought the official stamp from his office, usually reserved for land records and arrests, but today it would mark something far more precious. The endorsers? Ruth read on, her voice warming. Mrs. Sarah Tabaha and Mr. Atza Yazi testified to Jonah Pike's character and capability as guardian. Having witnessed his protection of the petitioned ward's interests during recent events concerning Heaven's Spring, Lena felt tears prick at her eyes, remembering all the moments that had led to this one. Jonah's gentle hands steadying her for stitches, his quiet teachings on the trail, his unwavering support through the court battle. She blinked rapidly, not wanting to miss a single moment of the ceremony. Does anyone present object to this petition? Ruth asked formally, though her smile suggested she knew there would be none. The morning breeze rustled the church's cotton curtains, carrying the scent of sage and early blooming wildflowers. In the distance, a meadowlark called, its song pure and sweet. Then I'll ask the principals to sign, Ruth said, laying the paper on a small table borrowed from her office. She dipped a pen in ink and held it out to Jonah first. His hand was steady as he signed, the scratch of the pen nib loud in the reverent quiet. Then Lena stepped forward, taking the pen carefully. Her signature looked small next to his, but just as certain. Mrs. Tabaha signed next, making her mark with dignity, followed by Atza's clear signature. Sheriff Good stepped forward with his stamp, pressing it firmly against the paper beside the signatures. The sharp sound seemed to seal more than just ink to paper. Judge Harland, who had stayed in town after yesterday's ruling, cleared his throat. As circuit judge for this territory, he said formally, I give my verbal blessing to this guardianship. May it serve the welfare of the ward and the good of the community. His weathered face softened as he added, You've chosen well, both of you. Lena couldn't hold back her tears any longer. She turned to Jonah, who opened his arms without hesitation. The rough wool of his coat was familiar now against her cheek, smelling of tobacco and saddle leather and safety. His hand came up to cradle the back of her head, just as it had that first day in the church kitchen. I reckon we ought to do this proper, he said softly, and she felt him shift. His calloused palm cupped her cheek, careful of the scar that no longer seemed to matter. Just as he had when they first met, he bent to place a gentle blessing on her forehead, his breath warm against her skin. You're claimed now, girl, he whispered, proper and legal and true. Mrs. Tabaha stepped forward to embrace them both, murmuring a traditional blessing in Navajo. Preacher Ruth wiped her eyes with her handkerchief, and even Sheriff Good looked suspiciously misty. The moment was broken by the sound of wagon wheels on the street. The Martinez family was pulling up to the spring with tools and buckets, ready to begin the day's work. Other townspeople appeared, carrying ropes and shovels, lunch baskets, and water jugs. Shall we? Jonah asked, stepping back but keeping one hand on Lena's shoulder. They made their way down to Heaven's Spring, where the morning sun sparkled on water that now belonged to everyone. The wooden diversion box Jonah had built years ago stood partially exposed, its timbers weathered but still sound. Teams were already forming, some clearing brush while others assessed repairs. Atza organized a group to check the flow gauge, explaining how the measurements should be recorded. Mrs. Martinez and her daughters set up a food station in the shade, laying out tortillas and beans for the workers. Chinese, Mexican, Anglo, and Diné worked side by side, passing tools and sharing water dippers. The morning warmed steadily, but no one seemed to mind the heat. Laughter and conversation floated on the breeze as people who had stood divided just days ago now worked together. Someone started singing a work song in Spanish. Others joined in, adding verses in English and Navajo. Lena helped where she could, carrying water to the workers and holding boards steady for repairs. She watched Jonah demonstrate how the diversion system worked, his hands sure on the worn wood as he explained the proper flow rates for different seasons. His voice carried the same patient tone he'd used teaching her to read weather signs on the trail. Near noon, Mrs. Tabaha called everyone to rest in the shade of the cottonwoods. She passed out cups of cool spring water, blessing each one before giving it. The water tasted sweeter somehow, Lena thought, now that it flowed freely for all. "You know," Preacher Ruth said, settling on a log beside Lena, "I've been thinking about that marriage record of your parents that never got filed." She smiled, the sun catching the silver in her hair. "Maybe some things work out exactly as they're meant to, even when they don't follow the usual path." Lena looked around at the gathered community. Mrs. Tabaha sharing fry bread with Mrs. Martinez, Atza showing Mr. Chen how to check the water gauge, Sheriff Good and Judge Harland discussing plans for maintaining order at the spring. Her gaze came to rest on Jonah, who caught her looking and gave her a gentle wink. The afternoon passed in steady work and easy companionship. The diversion box was cleaned and reinforced, the spring's banks cleared of debris, and the path widened for easier access. Someone found Jonah's old flow measurements carved into the box's timber and carefully retraced them with fresh paint. As the sun began to slope westward, the workers stepped back to admire their progress. The spring burbled clear and strong, its water flowing smoothly through the restored channels. New markers showed where each family could draw their share, with extra space set aside for travelers and their stock. The breeze carried the mingled scents of sage, fresh-cut wood, and clean water. Laughter drifted up from where children played in the shallow edges of the stream, their voices bright with the simple joy of cool water on hot feet. Lena stood beside the diversion box, running her hand along its smooth timber. The wood felt warm from the sun, solid and dependable, like Jonah himself. Her fingers found the freshly painted numbers, each one representing years of careful stewardship before she was born. "Your pa helped me build this," Jonah said quietly, coming to stand beside her. "He had a good eye for grade and flow. Taught me some things about water rights, too." He paused, then added, "He'd be proud to see you standing up for what's right." "Do you think—" Lena hesitated, then pressed on. "Do you think my mother would be proud, too?" "I didn't know her well," Jonah admitted, "but I remember how she stood tall when she married your pa in Preacher Ruth's church. Proud and sure, just like you've been these past days." He squeezed her shoulder gently. "She'd be proud as summer rain." The air filled with the sound of horses nickering softly, wagon wheels creaking, and people calling good evenings as they began heading home. The day's work was done, but something more lasting had been built alongside the repairs. Understanding between neighbors, trust between cultures, bridges between hearts. Mrs. Tabaha stopped to embrace Lena one more time before leaving. "You see?" she said softly in Navajo. "The water knows its family, and now you know yours too." She touched Lena's cheek where the scar had once seemed so important, then included Jonah in her smile. All is in harmony. As the sun painted the western sky in shades of gold and rose, Lena and Jonah walked back toward town together. Their shadows stretched long behind them, merging with the evening like father and daughter, guardian and ward, two hearts finding home in each other. The late afternoon sun cast long shadows across the freshly painted sign at Heaven Spring. The careful brushstrokes spelled out, "Shared by Covenant," in clean black letters against whitewashed wood. Mrs. Martinez had added delicate flowering vines along the edges, while Mrs. Tabayaha had worked in traditional Diné patterns between the words. Together, the designs spoke of two cultures finding common ground. Women gathered at the spring's edge, their skirts rustling as they filled buckets and exchanged news of the day. Mrs. Chen taught Mrs. Rodriguez's daughter how to properly balance two pails on a carrying pole, while Mrs. Tabaha shared her method for keeping water cool in clay vessels. Their laughter mingled with the splashing sounds of children playing in the shallow parts of the stream. "Mind you don't muddy the drinking water," called Mrs. Martinez, but her tone was fond as she watched the little ones cool their feet in the clear flow. Near the diversion box, Jonah sat on a smooth boulder with Lena and Atza, spreading out a much-handled map across their knees. The paper crackled softly in the warm breeze as they traced possible routes for future survey work. "Judge Harland says you can study with his daughter's tutor in town 3 days a week," Jonah said, his weathered finger following a trail line. "That'll leave time for practical work too, mapping the water courses, learning the old boundaries." Atza nodded approvingly. "The people need good maps that show both ways of knowing the land. Your mother's skill with the old stories, your father's way with measures. You carry both in your hands." Lena traced the familiar shapes of hills and valleys on the map. feeling the future open before her like a fresh page. I could help mark the shared grazing lands too, she said. Make sure everyone knows where their herds can water. Good thinking, Jonah agreed. Proper records prevent arguments later on. He folded the map carefully, tucking it into Lena's satchel. Speaking of proper things, Preacher Ruth's expecting us for supper. The sun was setting as they made their way to the church, painting the adobe walls in shades of gold and rose. The kitchen windows glowed with welcoming lamplight, and savory smells drifted out to greet them. Inside, Ruth stirred a pot of rich beef stew while Mrs. Tabaha shaped cornbread on a griddle. The familiar scents of sage, chilies, and fresh bread filled the warm air. Sheriff Good sat at the long table, his hat respectfully set aside as he helped Judge Harland sort through watershare documents. Just in time, Ruth said, ladling stew into heavy ceramic bowls. The bread's nearly done. They gathered around the table, shoulders touching comfortably in the small space. The lamp cast a gentle glow over their faces as Ruth offered a simple blessing for the food and the company. Conversation flowed easily between bites, plans for reinforcing the spring's banks before winter, news of births and marriages, stories that needed no translation to bring smiles. Lena sat between Jonah and Mrs. Tabaha, soaking in the warmth of belonging. The scar on her cheek no longer felt like a mark of separation. Looking around at these faces, Anglo, Danae, and everything between, she remembered her words from that first night in this kitchen. I've never been kissed. She spoke them again now, softly, but this time there was no pain in them, only gratitude for how far she'd come. The words floated in the lamplit air like a reminder of past loneliness, transformed into present joy. Jonah's eyes met hers across the table, crinkling at the corners with understanding. Trust me, he said, just as he had that first night, but now the words carried the weight of promises kept and faith proven true. Around the table, heads nodded in quiet agreement. Trust had been earned in small moments and large ones, in standing together for justice, in sharing water and work, in choosing peace over violence. The whole room already trusted, not just in Jonah, but in each other and the covenant they'd made to care for the spring and its people. Through the open window came the steady murmur of flowing water. Heaven's spring sang its constant song, a promise kept in motion, sustaining the web of relationships gathered here in this warm kitchen. Like the spring itself, their bonds would continue to flow and deepen, nourishing the roots of community they'd planted together. Mrs. Tabaha passed the cornbread, her calloused hands gentle on the plate. Ruth refilled cups with fresh spring water that caught the lamplight like liquid gold. Outside, a cooling breeze carried the mingled voices of English, Spanish, and Navajo from the street, while inside, the simple act of sharing food spoke its own language of belonging. Thank you for listening. Stories connect us in the most unexpected ways. If you felt that spark today, make sure you're subscribed. I share a new one daily, and the next might change your day.